will be a hearing on HB 2291. And staff, could you give us an overview on the bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. House Bill 2291 would establish a regulatory relief division within the Office of the Attorney General to administer and support the General Regulatory Sandbox Program. The Attorney General would appoint a director for the division who would report to the Attorney General and could appoint staff with approval. Such staff would be limited to one full-time and one part-time employee unless otherwise approved by legislative appropriations. The division would administer the General Regulatory Sandbox Program and act as a liaison between private businesses and agencies. Just a quick note, the term agency is defined to exclude the judicial and legislative branches. The agency or the office could review state laws that may unnecessarily inhibit business success and recommend changes to the governor and the legislature. The division could propose reciprocity agreements with other states that use or propose to use similar sandbox programs. And then for a moment, if you are following the bill, I'm going to jump down to page 4 where it talks about the program itself. The program would allow businesses to demonstrate innovative offerings without obtaining the otherwise required certification or registration required by state law. However, the program could not waive or suspend any state or federal licensing requirements or related rules and regulations, or any tax fee or charge administered under Chapter 79, which is taxation of state law. The program would also be prohibited from waiving or suspending rules and regulations that are related to alcoholic beverages. The Regulatory Relief Division could enter into agreements with or adopt the best practices of federal agencies or other states. The division could also consult with businesses in the state about existing or potential proposals for the Sandbox program. And then just a quick word about the terminology. It talks about certification or registration and doesn't include licensing, but those terms aren't currently defined in the bill, arguably be pretty difficult to do so. But I have a couple examples just really quick about current statutes that talk about those different terms. So KSA 39-1908 is KDAD's credentialing program. That statute requires licenses for adult care home administrators and dietitians, but certifications instead of licenses are required for residential care facility operators, activity directors, social service designees, nurse aides, medication aides, home health aides. So those people have to be certified. They're certified by a licensed, or they're supervised by a licensed person. And so those certification requirements are an example of something that would be potentially subject to this program. Some of their requirements could be waived or suspended. An example for registration, KSA 1308 concerns certified public accountancy firms. So firms practicing certified public accountancy in Kansas are required to register with the Kansas Board of Accountancy, and under state law, their requirements for registration include ensuring that a majority of the firm's ownership consists of licensed CPAs. So that particular requirement is another example of something that could be temporarily waived underneath the Sandbox program. So back to the bill. Jumping back to page 2, it would establish an advisory committee. An 11-person advisory committee would be established to advise the Regulatory Relief Division. The committee would meet as needed and provide recommendations on applications. Concerning the actual application process itself, applicants would need to provide detailed information about their innovative offerings and how they would benefit consumers. The division could charge a fee not to exceed $250 for each application. The division would be required to maintain confidentiality of the application information. The Regulatory Relief Office would be required to consult with applicable agencies to determine if more information is needed from the applicant and seek necessary information to complete an application. The bill would require applicable agencies to provide a written report within 30 days of receiving a complete application describing potential harm to consumers and recommending whether the application should be admitted or denied. At this point, I'm on page 6 of the bill. If an agency fails to deliver a report, it would be assumed that the agency does not object to the waiver or suspension. So this particular language is a little similar to what the committee heard in that permit fast-tracking bill. Concerning application rejection or approval, agencies could reject applications if they fail to comply with federal standards or if approval would create substantial risk or expenses. If an applicable agency rejects an application, the Regulatory Relief Office could not approve the application unless the advisory committee recommends approval by a 2/3 vote. And that's on page 7, lines 25 through 35. The advisory committee would review applications and provide recommendations based on agency reports. The director could deny applications for any reason, including potential harm to consumers. The bill would allow applicants to become sandbox participants if approved by the Regulatory Relief Office with specific rules and regulations waived or suspended. The director would provide notice of the approval to the public and to the applicant's competitors through the AG's or the division's own website. Sandbox participants would have 12 to 24 months to demonstrate their innovative offering with certain consumer protections in place. Sandbox participants would need to disclose certain information to consumers, including potential risks and the temporary nature of the offering. At this point, I'm on page 10 of the bill, lines 17 through 40. The Regulatory Relief Office could require additional disclosures to protect consumers. Participants would not be subject to enforcement of waived rules during the demonstration period except for criminal offenses. The Regulatory Relief Office could terminate participation at any time for any reason. And then concerning reporting and evaluation for the program, the director would submit annual reports to legislative committees, including information on program participants and recommendations for legal changes. Sandbox participants would be required to retain records and report any incidents of consumer harm to the Regulatory Relief Office, each applicable agency, and the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules and Regulations. Participants could request an extension of a demonstration period, which the Regulatory Relief Office could grant for up to an additional 12 months. The Regulatory Relief Office could end a participant's involvement at any time if they're not operating in good faith. The Regulatory Relief Office would maintain a website for public suggestions on reducing regulatory burdens and compile those suggestions into reports for the government. House Bill 2291 would become effective upon publication in the statute book. With that, I'd be happy to take any preliminary questions.
Committee, are there any questions? Yes, Senator Blue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kyle, I want to start off by saying I appreciate you. This is great. So first, it's only current regulations, so not the JCAR. If something were to be presented for new regulations, this sandbox authority would not step in.
My recollection of the bill, I don't remember language saying it's only prospective. Are you seeing express language to the contrary?
No, my question is if an agency came out with proposed regulations to start the whole process, could this group, what am I trying to say, administrative board, come in and say, this is overstepping, or this is going to hurt the future, whatever they're trying to work on?
The new office and the advisory committee can make recommendations to the agencies concerning those regulations, but it wouldn't have any sort of role in overriding potential regulations. And it would give waivers and suspensions to current regulations that are on the books.
And the current, and the waivers would be if it passed by 2/3.
That applies if the agency initially declined the application. That denial by the applicable agency could be overridden by the advisory committee by a 2/3 vote. But otherwise, if the agency signs off on it and the director of the new office signs off on it, then the waiver would go into effect.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Ware.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. My question is about the breadth of this. I know you mentioned KDADs and CPAs and that sort of thing. Could this apply to any and all in the state, or is there a more finite list or concept about how this would apply?
On one end, it wouldn't apply to licenses required by federal and state law, but then we get back into the question of terminology. In layman's terms, one general distinction for a certification is that it's someone goes to a non-government entity to get some sort of, proof of qualification, I suppose. And so my question when reading the bill is that if a certification or a registration is required by law, how different legally is it from a license? Since the terms aren't defined though, I think the way you would know if something is subject to the bill or not is simply by how it's named in law. Is it called a certification? Is it called a license or a registration?
So we could conceivably be talking about quite a breadth, a very long list, potentially.
I think as long as there's a required authorization under state law that is not referred to as a license, then it could be potentially waived or suspended underneath the program.
Any other questions? Seeing none? Oh, wait. Senator Corson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm just trying to, I think, better understand kind of the structure here. So it seems like you'd have a law regulation and it would go through the legislature and we'd have, the normal legislative hearing process and people could weigh in and all of that. And then it would go to the governor and the governor could sign it or not sign it or veto it. And then if the legislature still really wanted it and they had the votes to override it, then it could come into law that way. And then you'd kind of have the attorney general, it feels like coming out a little bit out of left field. And then basically going to the legislature and saying, I think that you messed up and you could have done the law better this way or differently this way, or could have had a lesser regulatory effect if you did it this way. I mean, is that a little bit of how this works? I mean, they're going to look at law, the attorney general, who really doesn't have any expertise in this area, is going to kind of come in and kind of Monday morning quarterback the work of the legislature and the governor's office then, and tell them how the law could have been improved or could be better or may need to be repealed?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I suppose the initial timeline, if this bill became effective, is that this system enacted into law would have been done so by the legislature. And then going forward, it would be the AG's office through this director, the advisory committee, who would, according to like the purpose statement of the bill, be advising and consulting with businesses and agencies to make recommendations on how to make changes to the law or to rules and regulations, but it wouldn't have any sort of authority to override law itself.
Okay, I appreciate that. I mean, my thought is it just seems like we sort of have the hearing process to gather that sort of public input. People are able to provide that kind of testimony. They're able to obviously communicate with the governor's office. We have no shortage of businesses and entities that are well represented here who are able to testify. So it just feels to me like the AG would be kind of leaping in out of left field on this, but I want to hear more about the testimony. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes. Senator Dietrich.
So I'm reading the memorandum from the Office of the Budget as well, but it looks like in creating this new division in the AG's office, it's about 6 FTE. Am I reading that correctly? Be able to manage all this?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have not read the governor's office of the budget memo.
I guess my question would be, though, the way this has been structured, you have to create a new office somewhere.
Correct. And I will say again, in the bill itself, it does limit the amount of FTEs that the AG would be allowed to hire to one full-time, one part-time, unless there are additional appropriations by the legislature. So if that particular number is needed, it would still have to be approved through the legislative appropriation process.
Thank you, thank you.
Any other questions? Seeing none, we'll move on to our proponents. Our first proponent is Tanner Timble with Americans for Prosperity. Tanner?
Make sure the mic works first. Thank you, Chairman and members of the committee. Again, my name is Tanner Temple. I'm the Deputy State Director for Americans for Prosperity. I appreciate the time to speak on HB 2291, which again, creates a sandbox program that temporarily waives specific regulations for businesses to test innovations with an advisory committee oversight and protection measures for health and safety. The term regulatory sandbox actually comes from a UK Financial Authority November 2015 report where they outlined a regulatory sandbox as a safe space in which businesses can test innovations, services, business models, and a modified review with less regulations. The Kansas Administrative Regulatory Code contains 3.3 million words that businesses must use to assess restrictions on their businesses. A substantial amount of those are regulatory restrictions concentrated in manufacturing professional business services. These regulations will interfere with market competition and become a startup barrier if left unchecked. More extensive and older firms don't have to compete and innovate, keeping prices high and slower job growth. Conversely, the more startups, the more people are encouraged to go into business themselves and the more jobs are created. However, it is important to note that this does not mean sandboxes are a free-for-all. So that means health and safety, if reasons of that nature, they would be excluded from those. This bill is a growing compromise that allows innovation but maintains consumer health and safety, and businesses can test products, services, and business models and delivery without immediately incurring all the immediate regulatory consequences of engaging in that activity. Some of the changes that we made on the House, again, this is a bipartisan bill now. Again, it does go through the AG's office, so there will be an 11-member committee. House leadership and House minority leadership will pick members of the committee, as well as the Senate side. The remainder of the board is actually business people within the community that is appointed by the leader of this commission that's set up in the Attorney General's office. So I think someone was asking about full term or, another FTE. There's 2 FTEs tied to this, and the rest are picked from the business leaders and from the members of the House and the Senate. Again, really, what this bill takes the guesswork out of overregulation by allowing businesses to organically identify problem areas and present them to the commission to deregulate as long as it does not pose a health or safety risk. So we do urge this committee to pass this bipartisan bill.
Thank you. Any questions? Yes, Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony. You gave us the mechanics, but give us some examples, please. Thank you.
Yeah, so looking at out-of-states, for example, if you look at Uber, for example, so their fight with the taxi industry and how those were licensed at some point. Tesla struggles to offer direct from manufacturing car sales, drones that have struggled to gain steam in states, part due to the stringent regulatory environment. I guess the way to look at it is how many companies were crushed because regulations stopped them from getting off the ground. So examples of that nature. A lot of fintech have used those in there, and so that's kind of how they build that off the ground.
Follow-up, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Those aren't really Kansas issues. The drones is actually, we've got problems because of the potential coming from foreign adversaries. Could you give us some examples for Kansas? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, that's the beauty of this bill. The businesses will organically come to this commission. They can present these problems to this commission and get temporarily waivers on that. And so it is a faster process. And so that's the intent of the bill, to get them to organically come and present these problems.
Any other questions? Yes, Senator Reichman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your testimony. I'm still trying to figure this bill out, okay? I'm a little slow on this. Is this making government smaller or bigger, this bill?
Well, if you're adding 2 FTEs, I would say, I don't want to talk out my rear end, but I mean, I think, yes, there would be a couple extra FTEs that come along with this. But we're trying to take away some of the regulatory policies that these businesses incur. So I would say it's a double-edged sword if you look at it that way.
Any other comments? Yes, Senator Owens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was trying to think of kind of a specific example because I really love this idea. I love the idea of how do we get government out of the way until we have a business that is a proven viable offering. You mentioned drones, for example. I know Heinen Brothers here in Kansas, which is a nationwide global drone company, is currently working within the ag sector for spraying with drones. And they actually have an FAA certified drone testing area over southeast and east Kansas. And I could see them applying for something like this to reduce some of the state regulatory burden that might be placed on them by KDHE or others when it comes to ag spraying, to see if they can truly develop the actual marketplace before investing far more money and then having it squashed by government. So that's just one idea that kind of came to mind. But all in all, I like the idea and hate the FTEs. Thanks.
Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to get caught on the drones, but most of the regulation that drones are running to are federal issues, not state issues. And so this wouldn't be able to give any relief on federal regulation, would it?
Not that I'm aware of on the federal side. This does relate to state agencies. So again, I mean, these businesses are coming to this commission presenting ideas that maybe we didn't look at, and they're saying, I have X, Y problem, and if the commission approves it and they determine that doesn't pose a health and safety risk, then, you know, they can go ahead and approve that.
Senator Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just looking at some of the language here to try and think of an example. You mentioned something like an entity like Tesla that, you know, we obviously have licensed dealers for various companies. So the language says you can't waive a license requirement, but you can kind of waive a license requirement. So if I wanted to sell cars in Kansas, can you give me an example of how this would be beneficial if I'm not already licensed as a dealer here?
I don't know the answer to that answer specifically. Again, it does lift the licensure side of it, so I would have to look into that more deeply.
Did the question make sense? It says that it won't be construed to permit any waiver or suspension of a licensing requirement, but it also says you can be in the marketplace without obtaining certification or registration. And licensure was struck out. So I'm trying to figure out the legal differences in what we're allowing and what we're not. And if the revisor or research could answer that, that'd be fine. I don't understand what we're waiving exactly here.
Yeah, I don't have the answer specifically. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but, you know, on the licensure side, I can definitely dig into it and get back to you.
Staff have any input on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From my understanding of the language, I believe the intent was to not include state and federal licensing requirements. But I will say that on page 4, lines 13 through 16, language that was added in the House, I am also a little confused by that particular language. It was also maybe a bit unfortunate that the word permit started being used there as a verb instead of not a noun. But anyway, I think that's something that could be potentially ironed out with an amendment.
Any other comments or questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next proponent is Eric Stafford, Vice President of Government Affairs, Kansas Chamber. Is Eric here? Moving on, we have a WebEx, Dane Ishara, hope I pronounced that right, with the Utah Department of Commerce.
You were pretty close. So Dane Ishara with the Utah Office of Regulatory Relief. I don't have a set presentation, but just here to answer any questions that the committee may have.
Any questions? Yes, Senator Corson.
Thank you. I think from one of the questions I have is whether the Attorney General's office is the best and most appropriate place to house this. It seems like, and I don't know about how Utah is set up, but it seems like in Kansas we've got the Secretary of State's office, which is where businesses go to register. So that's where you go to file your paperwork, get established, register. And then you've got the Department of Commerce, which is really where, I think businesses are most accustomed to going to with various issues. The department is working on supporting businesses across the state of Kansas. I think I'm just confused of kind of how the Attorney General's office fits into this, and I'm wondering if maybe we could amend this in a way that maybe this office would be more appropriate to be in the Department of Commerce. Because again, I just think when we're talking about interfacing with Kansas businesses, I think they're not really used to going to the Attorney General's office. I mean, that's really kind of if there's a criminal law issue. But as far as their day-to-day and what can be done to really accelerate business growth, I think they're just much more comfortable, and their normal interface with state government is through the Department of Commerce. So I know that in Utah, it sounds like your office is located within the Department of Commerce. Can you just talk about how that's been effective for you, and if that's maybe something we should think about doing as we move forward here? Thank you.
Yeah, so our Office of Regulatory Relief is located within the Governor's Office of Economic Opportunity. So we work closely with our economic growth team. We use the regulatory office as one of the tools in our toolkit to recruit companies and also expand companies within Utah. And why it ended up in the Governor's Office of Economic Opportunity is we had a fintech sandbox and then also an insurance sandbox that were housed within those agencies. And part of the feedback we received is somebody didn't want to go to our insurance department and say, hey, I think we're going to violate your code or potentially violate your code. So the companies didn't feel comfortable going to the regulatory bodies. And that's why we put our industry agnostic sandbox within the Governor's Office of Economic Opportunity.
It would just seem like businesses would be comfortable going to the Department of Commerce as kind of, the department is really the advocacy arm for businesses, and that would be maybe where they're most comfortable going and saying, hey, we really feel like this regulation is burdensome or this regulation is impeding growth, things like that nature. I think that's kind of more where they would just normally have a liaison relationship than the Attorney General's office. I think for the most part, they wouldn't really be engaged with. So thank you for that color. I appreciate that very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Senator Owens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dane, thanks for being here. I hope all is well in the Silicon Slopes of Utah. I wanted to ask you, so one of the questions that you heard, can you provide some real life examples of how this legislation has been used in Utah, specifically avoiding anything drone related, but definitely, you mentioned fintech, you mentioned insurance, any other industries or ideas where you've seen this be successful?
One of our first applications was related to towing dispatch. And so it was similar to like a Lyft or Uber for towing dispatch. And so there were issues with how the fees could be flown or moved through the vehicle owner or the department, the specific municipality. So it was an application and the technology was new where the regulation didn't really match with what they were doing. So I think the towing dispatch is a good example of where technology is moving a little bit quicker than the regulation in a sense. And then the next year, the legislature had an opportunity to amend that statute that was holding up the business. So I think an example. A lot of the applications and conversations we have are platform-based companies that are just new in developing their product that will reach out and say, where, like, we feel we should be regulated, where and which agency would we potentially be regulated with.
Excellent. Thank you very much, sir.
Any other comments or questions? Thank you very much. We appreciate you being here today.
Yeah, thank you. Feel free to reach out if there's additional questions also.
Will do. Our next proponent is Reese Empley. Reese, he's the State Government Affairs. Morning.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony today. My name is Reese Empey, and I am the Senior Director of State Government Affairs at Libertas Institute, a nonprofit think tank based in Utah. Although we work on a range of issues in the state of Utah, it's my role to work with partners across the country to try and bring these innovative policies we've helped usher through the Utah State Legislature and bring them to other states. And regulatory sandboxes are something we've worked extensively on inside and outside of Utah. But what exactly is a sandbox? A sandbox enables innovators, both big and small, old and new, to work with regulators and legislators in trialing new services, products, and business models while rules and regulations that may be inapplicable or dated to new ideas are temporarily waived. So let's say this is a drone example. Let's say I have an, let's say I have an excellent idea for drone insurance, because why would I need the standard 6-month premium business model if I only fly the thing a few times a year? Or maybe I have a creative way to collect payments at my food truck business or to just run a food truck. The ideas and opportunities are limitless. I'd approach the sandbox, outline my great idea, highlight the rules and regulations preventing me from launching my product, and upon acceptance into the sandbox, I'd receive a temporary waiver of those rules and regulations, and I'm allowed to offer my product to consumers. Throughout the trial period, which is typically 2 or more years, depending on the state, I report to the sandbox and what's happening. Is anything going wrong? How many consumers am I engaged with, etc., so that the sandbox can compile a report based on the various trials occurring in the sandbox to kick recommended reforms and repeals to the applicable state agencies and even the state legislature. This allows the state agencies and the state legislature to make informed decisions on reforming, repealing, and even creating new regulations around new and innovative ideas so that these entities can exit the sandbox into a newly reformed regulatory environment, therefore benefiting all. Now, I want to mention that consumer protection is built into these sandboxes. An application with an idea that will obviously cause harm to consumers or the environment will never make it beyond the front door. If a company operating in the sandbox begins to act in bad faith, the sandbox can pull them from the sandbox at any time. And lastly, these companies can still be held civilly liable, even in the sandbox, for any potential harm. So overall, a sandbox invites the business community to the table to highlight troublesome rules and regulations, prove they're not working as intended through trials, and as a result, after reform and repeal, the state is better welcoming to the innovations of tomorrow. It is a living, breathing approach to regulatory reform that possesses safeguards for consumers and the environment. Now, there are 2 approaches. You can target certain industries such as agriculture, insurance, financial technologies, also known as fintech, and even salmon recovery, which is under consideration in Washington state. On the other hand, you can pursue a universal sandbox which applies to most industries. So a couple of examples closer to home. Next door in Nebraska, they approved an insurance sandbox in 2023, while Missouri approved a universal sandbox similar to this bill in Kansas this year. They went from no sandboxes to full universal, being the first state to do so. And on top of that, after Missouri approved their universal sandbox last year, Ohio recently introduced a bill, and Indiana plans to consider one next year. So across the entire country, there are 4 universal sandboxes set up in a similar way to this one: Arizona, Kentucky, Missouri, and Utah. And then there are 11 other states with more targeted sandboxes, targeting things such as financial technologies, insurance, and even energy. And that does not count Hawaii and Nevada's sunsetted fintech sandboxes. Now, I do want to note to a point earlier, Kentucky and Arizona's universal sandboxes are housed in the Attorney General's office. The reason they did that, they saw the Attorney General as, consumer protection is top of mind, and it just made sense for those states. Every state is different, like Utah houses theirs in the Economic Development Department. But as of now, there are only a dozen states that have yet to at least consider a sandbox of some kind. Now, out of the 15 total states that run sandboxes, there have been around 40 participants. But keep in mind, many of these sandboxes are still very new in the last couple of years and still being implemented and ironing out some of the kinks. Every state is different. So on top of that, as Dane sort of hinted at, many of these sandboxes have begun to serve as a liaison between businesses and the relevant regulatory agencies, which has allowed some companies to learn that they can operate without the sandbox. So in other words, rather than just temporarily waiving rules and regulations, these sandboxes are also helping companies get on their feet and learn they don't need the sandbox to operate. They're already legally allowed to operate, which does not require them to hire a high caliber lobbyist to go change the rules for them, or an expensive attorney to comb through the state's code. Both alternatives costing a lot of money, especially for smaller businesses. And from what we're hearing, these businesses really like having this liaison, sort of this advocate, especially when it is housed outside of any of the regulatory agencies. Now, this has been largely bipartisan across the country. Last year in Missouri, the Universal Sandbox received bipartisan support. Nebraska's insurance sandbox was carried across the finish line by Senator Anna Wishart, a Democrat, after initially introducing a universal sandbox bill in 2022. And you have states like Vermont hosting an insurance sandbox. Hawaii this year is considering a housing sandbox. And with this momentum growing for the smart regulatory reform at the state level, a bipartisan group in Congress has begun introducing federal legislation for the federal level. To date, 12 different sandbox bills targeting everything from fintech to AI and banking and even universal have been introduced. Now, lastly, there's the option for reciprocity agreements with other sandbox states, and even cooperation with federal sandboxes should one ever be approved and implemented. So let's say an innovative company enters Kansas' sandbox and they want to scale up. If they have an agreement with a state like North Carolina, Arizona, or even a reciprocity agreement with a federal sandbox, they instantly have their foot in the door into those markets and vice versa. So sandboxes provide opportunities for creative minds to try out their new and innovative ideas while providing regulators and legislators with real examples of regulations not working neatly in today's fast-moving, innovative world. Rather than startups or even existing companies spending thousands of dollars on lawsuits, lawyers, and lobbyists to change the law to accommodate them, which not all of them can afford, this offers a more affordable and transparent avenue to trial their ideas. And we can't begin to predict the potential life-changing or just plain cool ideas that may come as a result of this flexible living regulatory framework. Thank you for your time, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Committee, are there any questions? Yes, Senator Reichman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your testimony. I finally figured out what this stuff was. It took me a while. I think I like it. The one in here in Kansas, the one we're presenting is kind of like a full or a universal one. Would you talk on that, advantages or disadvantages of that as a partial? Thank you.
Absolutely. Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. So kind of telling, so Utah, we started with a financial technology sandbox in 2019. In 2020, Utah implemented an insurance sandbox, and we very quickly began to run into problems. Company X applies to the fintech sandbox, but maybe they're largely fintech or insurance, but they just touch this other area of regulation. And so therefore they aren't eligible for the sandbox. And so in Utah, it just became kind of a natural organic evolution to even, targeting one or two industries is too limited. In Utah particularly, we had instances where one agency created the regulation and then another agency enforced it, which caused a lot of issues with the sandboxes. And so we found that, kind of creating a one-stop shop for this program to be the best, the most seamless, kind of having this center focal point to bring in all the regulatory agencies, that are relevant to whatever application is in front of the sandbox. I've heard from states like Wyoming too, where they've had to, all the states with the more targeted sandboxes, they have stories where, you're mostly, an insurance product or financial technologies, but unfortunately we can't accept you because you also touch this other area of regulation. So a lot of these states, with Missouri being the exception, Arizona, Kentucky, and Utah all started with targeted sandboxes, and they ended up with universal because they recognized how limited those other targeted sandboxes were. And I got to give props to Missouri. They learned the lessons from these other states that, slowly tiptoed up, and they were just like, let's just go for the whole enchilada.
Any other questions? Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. That cleared up a lot of questions and kind of went through that pretty fast. But as far as answering the question why, maybe you could bring a little bit more in the AG's office for the, I think you said the consumer protection and the affordability is something. And I mean, from a federal to a state level, being able to help businesses get through quicker, to me, makes sense, the red tape and stuff. But if you could just touch on that area.
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. If I'm understanding correctly, Arizona, they were the very first state to pass a sandbox here in the United States, following the lead of the United Kingdom. I don't particularly know why, other than, they saw the AG's office as the obvious choice for consumer protection, this new innovative idea. At the time, Arizona's governor was Doug Ducey, the attorney general was Mark Brnovich, and I think it was the right place at the right time for the sandbox. So I can't really speak to that. But in Kentucky, interestingly enough, the initial version of the bill housed the universal sandbox in the governor's office of economic development. Kentucky, a similar state, Republican legislature, Democratic governor. And it was the economic development department that came back and requested basically a large fiscal note. And so it was actually the attorney general's office who approached the sponsor in Kentucky after calling over to Arizona's to say, hey, how much do you actually spend on this? How much time do you spend on this sandbox program? And as after Kentucky's attorney general at the time spoke with Arizona's, he came back and said, I think we can do this in our office without much additional funding. So that's kind of how it unfolded in Kentucky. I don't particularly have a preference on it. Every state is different. Every state has their own dynamics. Wyoming, they've considered housing it in the Commerce Department. Mississippi, when we worked on it, they were like, let's put it with the Secretary of State's office. So I don't necessarily have a dog in this fight where it should go, but I hope I offered some insight.
Any other comments? Yes, Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony. So as I listened to you, it was interesting because you've pointed out nationwide in almost every state that you've talked about, Democrats and Republicans agree that we have too many laws and too many regulations. So instead of trying to address the problem, we're going to create another group to a subset which gets to supersede the problem.
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. I think we need to look at a sandbox in a different light. That, a lot of states approach, we need regulatory reform, we need to slash red tape. And then they all get around, Utah does this too. And they all get around, they're like, where do we actually start? And there are the obvious regulations, red tape that are just like, yeah, that needs to go, that's so outdated. But then what we found in a lot of these sandbox states by opening, this olive branch of peace, come work with us, we want to help you innovate. There are a lot of obscure regulations that, maybe a legislative committee or, an advisory committee would not pick up. So I'd say this is opening the door for smart regulatory reform to invite these entrepreneurs, these innovators, businesses, et cetera, to the table. And under, companies in the sandbox are under more of a watchful eye than outside of the sandbox. And it's those trials, if regulation X is waived and the sky doesn't fall, that gives the legislature and the applicable agencies like a lot of information to make an informed decision on how do we reform this, how do we repeal it, or how do we create a new regulation around this new innovative idea without stifling it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm just trying to get my head around some of the implementation piece of this. So you have this Office of Regulatory Relief, and let's say it's in the AG's office. So you also have an advisory committee. So if I'm a company who wants to apply to get membership into this sandbox, not knowing what else to call it, is it that person in the AG's office who's the director that allows that, or does this advisory committee play a role in that? I'm a little confused on who does what.
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. Yeah, there's kind of, and after the amendments made in the House, there was definitely some language borrowed from what Missouri did. All right, let's say I've got this great idea. I approach Kansas's universal sandbox. I highlight the rules and regulations. A lot of times these sandboxes will have an initial meeting before asking these companies to fill out a whole application. Whether maybe they're already legally allowed to operate, et cetera. Maybe they need some help. A lot of these startups can't even begin to identify what's standing in their way. So let's say we get past that initial meeting, I put in my application. The director of the sandbox then takes it to the advisory committee, as well as, let's say my application touches agriculture, insurance, and maybe commerce. And they all get to review my application as well. And as Tanner was mentioning, those agencies can veto this. If even one of those agencies says, no, we don't want this to go through, my application could potentially stop there. Unless, the advisory committee, which is a group of just various minds, et cetera. And in Utah, we've had to amend our advisory committee, and I can get to that in a second. The advisory committee also reviews these applications to make recommendations to the director. And, let's say agency X says, we don't want this, that advisory committee can overturn that, just say, no, we're still gonna let this go through. Does that make sense, or did I cause the water to get murkier? And I guess one thing to add, in Utah, we started with an 11-member advisory committee in the sandbox. And after a few years of operating, it became clear, like some of these ideas, we just didn't have experts on the advisory committee who knew what in the world some of these ideas were. So we, if I remember correctly, we amended the advisory committee language in Utah from 11 to 9 members with the ability of the director to appoint up to 3 temporary members of the advisory committee. Just in case, those pre-existing 9 members don't have expertise on an application, they can go find, the right brains to offer insight into this application on a temporary basis.
Senator Owens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I really do find this to be fascinating when I think about how we as a state promote and look at entrepreneurship and business development. We've had a lot of discussions this year over tax credits for businesses and different ways to amend, increase, subtract tax credits. Well, this is taking a whole different approach, one that arguably is far less costly than a tax credit. And that is, in essence, creating a committee that just helps the government get the heck out of the way of entrepreneurship sometimes, when it makes sense, right? When safety is not hindered or something like that. And so the more I hear, the more I really, really love this idea, because it is a different approach to commerce and business development, one that we have historically not explored and certainly haven't been good at. And the only answer we've ever really had are more tax credits for this, that, or the other. So just a couple of comments. I really appreciate your explanation and understanding of this is very, very helpful. Thank you.
Yes, Senator Ware.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. This is really an intriguing idea, I have to say. Who wouldn't want to get rid of, or be able to work around any inapplicable rules or regulations or ones that are outdated? But I still have some concerns, and in many, many cases, those rules and regulations are there for a good reason, or at least certainly a good original intent. So I guess I'd like to hear more about the consumer and or public safety and making sure that how does that part of it work?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. I agree with you. A lot of these regulations were created with very good intent, but when they've been sitting on the books for 50, 60 plus years, I mean, we didn't have these things. This is fairly a new thing, or personal computers. So with the consumer protection, and like I said, in my presentation, the application process is meant to weed out those ideas that are obviously going to cause harm to the consumers, the environment, et cetera. And then these companies have to report. They're under a very close eye of this sandbox administrator. And the sandbox administrator, if Director Ishihara was still on, they don't want anything to go wrong in their own sandbox. They feel a great degree of ownership in this. And, with that company constantly reporting to the sandbox, it's meant to inform the applicable agencies as well as the state legislature with these real examples. Regulation, there were 3 trials in the sandbox. Regulations X, Y, and Z were temporarily waived. Consumers were happy. They were getting this product, service delivered to them, et cetera. And that really helps inform decisions on reform, repeal, et cetera, based on that. And if something goes wrong, these companies can still be held civilly liable. The sandbox will find out, and they can pull companies out of the sandbox at any time. So.
How often, is there an average, how often these companies make these reports? How careful is the oversight, I guess?
That varies state by state. I think, don't quote me on this, I think once a quarter. And then the sandbox itself compiles, at least in Utah and many of these other states, I can't remember the Kansas language off the top of my head. The sandbox then reports to the legislature annually. with, this is what the sandbox did, this is what happened, did we have any consumer complaints, et cetera.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know we're about out of time here, so if I'm understanding regulatory relief, I was trying to read ahead on this. So a participant in this, is there like a time frame? How long? And can you speak to that a little bit?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. Yeah, that depends on a state-by-state basis. If I remember the amended language in Kansas, I might defer to Tanner. I believe it's a 24-month base trial period with the opportunity to request an additional 12-month extension. In Kansas's, then you have states like Missouri where, they have an initial 24-month trial period, and you can get up to 7 years total of trial. It just depends state by state. There are companies that were in Arizona's sandbox that did not stick around for the entire trial period. They got what they needed in, maybe 8-9 months, and they were like, all right, we can exit now. We're ready. We proved our concept. We don't need to stay in the sandbox. So it just depends state by state, but I believe Kansas is a 24-month with an additional 12-month extension.
Any questions or comments? Seeing none, thank you very much. We'll close our hearing on House Bill 2291. Committee, tomorrow we will be hearing House Bill 2340 and possible final action on HB 2088 and 2119 and 2338. So we will be working on those tomorrow. Nothing else for the committee. Thank you very much, and we are adjourned.